Can a country's temperature make it poor? It may sound incredible, but when we look at the data where the wealthiest countries are located and those that have underdeveloped economies, one thing becomes very clear. Almost every country that has a high GDP per capita is in the colder regions of the world. Conversely, nations with lower GDP per capita are typically found in the much hotter tropics regions. So why does it appear that warmer countries are struggling to keep up? Does the cold really help an economy? Or is there something else going on? When we study a map of the GDPs by country around the world, a pattern immediately begins to emerge. It would seem that the majority of countries in the tropics or warmer regions of the planet, on average, tend to have a lower GDP than countries that are in more temperate or colder regions.
Hello guys, welcome back from that quick one. We are in summer now. The weather has changed. Europe is now leading Africa by 1 hour. So let me say not really Africa, but Ghana by 1 hour. So now I want to do some quick analysis why the colder countries have higher GDP more than the warmer countries. I want you to watch this documentary, and after that we will get to understand why the warmer countries look poorer than the colder countries. And see, the Bible analysis kakra bi why the colder regions in the world seem to have higher GDP. On say omo sikasem ne omo mpuntuo no ewo so. Emfa ne say omo ye more developed than ye na emfa ne say ye wo tropics no. Ye warmer countries no, like Africa and those countries no. A share documentary na yenya ntiase pa ewo mu ntia. Countries like Ghana, Nigeria, like Africans, na ye poor. Esin omo Europe no. Adinti no omo se cold ninti na ma omo esikasem ne omo etimi more richer than the warmer regions, which is Africa na say dinti pa na ema the colder regions na say colder countries no ewo higher GDP. Ana omumpuntu no woso esen kame say na ye warmer countries na emphasize nka bibia okay a nka osenka etimi etumpon no nti yenhwe documentary mba na yensan embra me pensim mu kakra yenkohwe documentary mba.
There are most certainly outliers in this observation, but overall, when we look at economic data, countries with lower average temperatures tend to have stronger economies than countries with warmer temperatures. Let's look at some specific examples. The top 5 largest economies in 2021 were the United States, with a GDP close to $23 trillion, China at $17.7 trillion, Japan at $4.8 trillion, Germany at $4.2 trillion, and the United Kingdom at $3.2 trillion. You'll notice that all 5 of these countries are in either temperate or colder parts of the world. But what about GDP per capita? The countries with the highest GDP at purchasing power parity per capita are Luxembourg, Singapore, Ireland, Qatar, and Norway. This is more mixed in terms of climate region than GDP. But if we look at a larger data set, 14 out of the top 20 countries with the highest GDP per capita are outside of the tropics. This means that 70% of countries with high GDPs per capita are in more temperate parts of the world, which is clearly statistically significant. What this suggests is that there is a strong correlation between average temperature and the economic growth of a nation. But as we know, correlation does not always equal causation. One of the most common examples of this is the correlation between increased ice cream sales and an increased number of drownings. If you look at just the data, these two things have a strong correlation. As ice cream purchases increase, drownings also increase. Therefore, if no further analysis was done, it could be assumed that people eating ice cream directly resulted in more people drowning. However, we know this is not the case, since there is a third variable in this example that's not being considered: summer. Many people buy ice cream in the summer because it's hot, which is also the reason that more people go swimming. Therefore, both variables tend to increase at the same time as a result of warm weather, not because ice cream causes drownings. Whenever examining a cause and effect scenario, we have to analyze the data carefully and be careful not to jump to conclusions and assume that correlation equals causation, since there are a few reasons why it might not. The first, like in the previous example, is that there could be a third unknown variable that causes the two variables to correlate. Here, that third variable was summer. Then there is the possibility of data collection errors. Maybe the sample size was too small and not indicative of the cause and effect relationship overall. And finally, perhaps the pattern is just the result of random chance. It is very possible that two unrelated things can seem to be correlated, when in reality, it's just a coincidence. However, more often than not, when two things correlate but there is no causal relationship, it's because of an unknown third variable. So let's dive into the data around a region's temperature and its GDP and see what we might be working with here. When the average temperature and GDP per capita are compared between 98 countries around the world, the data seems to support the observation that the warmer a country is, the lower its GDP per capita is. The statistical analysis paints a clear picture that there is some type of correlation between these two variables. However, until we analyze the data further, we cannot conclude whether there is a causal link between temperature and GDP. So let's dig into the data even deeper. It would seem that there are two possibilities when examining the raw data. Either colder climate results in higher GDP, or countries that have high GDPs somehow cause the climate around them to become colder. We can immediately eliminate the second hypothesis because we know that the reason regions closer to the equator are warmer is because they receive more direct sunlight year-round, and areas of the planet that are colder receive less direct sunlight. Therefore, we can safely say that the temperature of an entire region is not influenced by how much money the countries in that part of the world make. So, the much more logical conclusion to draw from this data is that temperature somehow influences the economy of a nation. But we also know that there are many factors that can do this. Government stability, natural resources, credit rating, infrastructure, and many other variables contribute to a country's overall GDP. Therefore, in order to continue analyzing the connection between temperature and GDP, we need to make sure that the correlation between these two variables is statistically significant. In order to do this, statisticians use what is called the coefficient of determination, or R-squared. At a basic level, this value indicates how much of the variation in the dependent variable can be predicted from the independent variable. What we need to know right now is if the R-squared in the temperature versus the GDP dataset we are examining is statistically significant. It turns out that it ends up being about 0.087 or 8.7%. This means almost 9% of a country's GDP per capita is determined by its average temperature. To put this into perspective, according to the data, every 1 degree Celsius increase in average temperature causes the GDP per capita to fall by around $762. Once again, there are definitely a lot of different factors that influence a country's GDP. But from this data, it appears that temperature plays a statistically significant role. This is supported by the fact that warmer temperatures causing a decrease in GDP is not just a phenomenon at a global level, but happens within continents themselves as well. When we examine the difference in economic output between Africa and South American countries, the same trend as before holds true. South America has a nominal GDP of around $4.04 trillion. Africa has a nominal GDP of $3.14 trillion. On average, warmer countries in these two continents have lower GDP per capita than nations that lie in more temperate climates. For example, Uruguay, Argentina, and Chile all of which lie further away from the equator and have average temperatures lower than the rest of South America, have higher GDPs per capita. In 2021, Uruguay had the highest GDP per capita at around $17,313 per year, followed by Chile at $16,265 and Argentina at $10,636. Conversely, the countries along the equator had much lower GDP per capita. Colombia is about $6,104, Ecuador's $5,965, and Suriname's GDP per capita is around $4,869. The average temperature in Uruguay is 17.5 degrees Celsius, or 63.5 degrees Fahrenheit. The average temperature in Suriname is around 26 degrees Celsius, or 78.8 degrees Fahrenheit. The disparity between the GDP per capita seems to be correlated to the differences in average temperature. In Africa, there is a similar story. Botswana, South Africa, and Libya are some of the richest countries in continental Africa. They also sit further away from the equator than most other nations on the continent. South Africa's GDP per capita is $7,055, Botswana's is $6,805, and Libya's is $6,357. At the other extreme, Burundi has a GDP per capita of $221.5, Sierra Leone's is $480, and the Democratic Republic of Congo's GDP per capita is about $577. There are a lot of other factors affecting the economies in Africa, but the trend between proximity to the equator, where annual temperatures tend to be high, and lower GDP seems to be corroborated in this data set as well. Even when we look at a single country like Australia, the same phenomenon seems to hold true. Darwin has a large amount of natural resources and closer access to major trading partners like China, Indonesia, and India. Therefore, you would think Darwin would be one of the wealthier cities in the country. Instead, Darwin is the poorest capital city in Australia, and as to be expected based on our hypothesis, it is also the hottest. Darwin has an average temperature of 28.2 degrees Celsius, or 82.8 degrees Fahrenheit, thanks in part to its position in the northern tip of Australia, closest to the equator. On the other hand, you might expect cities like Melbourne and Sydney, which are further away from shipping lanes and lack the natural resources that Darwin has, to be poorer. And yet, they are the two wealthiest cities in the country. As you'd expect, the climates in Melbourne and Sydney are much more moderate, with annual temperatures around 60 degrees Fahrenheit or 15.6 degrees Celsius. In 2022, the city of Melbourne had a GDP of 215 billion Australian dollars. Sydney had a GDP of 141 billion Australian dollars, and Darwin only had a GDP of 9.8 billion Australian dollars. So even within a country, the proximity to the tropics can have an impact on an economy. To take it a step further, researchers at MIT have even studied whether warmer temperatures from year to year could affect economic output. It was found that within developing economies, an increase in average annual temperature by just 1 degree Celsius corresponds to a 1.1% decrease in GDP per capita. This was a startling find, as researchers noted that an economy that is going strong can be thrown into a recession with only a 3% shift in its GDP. So a sudden increase in temperature could result in serious economic impacts. But why do temperatures seem to play such an important role in a country's GDP? There are a number of reasons that warmer temperatures can correlate to a decrease in economic output, from decreased crop yields to worker productivity slowing when it's unbearably hot. In fact, it wasn't too long ago that entire governments would often have to shut down due to high temperatures and no air conditioning. What this means is that as global temperatures continue to increase as a result of climate change, entire economies could be threatened. It is clear that there is some kind of correlation between high temperatures and decreased economic output. We now need to look at the past and see what we can learn about this phenomenon from history. Then we can use the data we have today and examine exactly what is going on with the correlation between temperature and GDP. When we investigate the past, something surprising emerges. Unlike today, some of the most powerful and prosperous economies and empires in the world developed in the tropics or in areas where the average temperature was hotter than most. However, when we examine the way civilization formed and grew in the past, everything starts to become clear. And that's because before industrialization, if a civilization wanted to grow large, win wars, and spread influence, then it needed to sustain a large population. And in order to do that, it needed one very important thing: food, and lots of it. Thousands and even hundreds of years ago, agriculture and horticulture were the major industries of every empire and kingdom. And during this time, warm climates provided an advantage. If the weather was warm all or most of the year, crops could be grown virtually non-stop. This would eventually lead to soil degradation and sometimes famine. However, since there were a lot fewer people than there are today, new land could almost always be cleared and crop yields would rebound. This allowed warmer climates to support larger populations than colder climates in the past. The warm climates of Mesopotamia, Egypt, Central America, and India gave rise to some of the largest empires in the world. However, when you look at those very same locations today, they are, on average, less wealthy than countries in colder climates. That being said, while populations in warmer climates were growing and thriving, the populations in colder climates of the world weren't just sitting, waiting to be conquered by their warm weather neighbors. They were gaining a skill that would allow them to flourish in the future. Some researchers suggest that the cold climates where the struggle to survive during winter months was common may have actually led to innovations and practices that would benefit these parts of the world in centuries to come. The theory basically says that populations in cold climates would need to find innovative ways to increase crop yields and store them to make it through barrenness that accompanied freezing temperatures. This resulted in people hoarding and storing resources, building more complex structures to combat the elements, and planning for long-term growth and development, even if this was only happening at the family or community level. Populations in warmer climates, however, did not necessarily need to innovate in the same ways. That's not to say that these people weren't working hard to improve their lives or to innovate in their own way. But the environment they lived in did not require the same type of resource hoarding or annual challenges for survival that populations in the north had to contend with. If the status quo had remained the same and agriculture was the main industry of civilization, as industrialization warmer territories would have continued. Farming became less labor-intensive and crops could be gathered more quickly. An empire's strength was no longer contingent on it being able to grow crops all year round, as better storage devices were developed and trade opportunities expanded. It was during the age of exploration, the scientific revolution, and the industrial era that economic practices shifted, and many of the structures we see today took form. Today, economics are not dependent on how much food a country can grow, because whatever they need can be imported as long as there is money to do so. Instead, our global economy runs on technology, industry, and innovation. Once this shift in economics and wealth indicators occurred, strange things began to happen. Research suggests that in 1820, countries in tropical zones still had a gross national product, or GNP, per capita of around 70% of temperate zone countries. However, by 1992, this percentage had plummeted to the tropics having a GNP closer to 25% of that of colder countries. And in case you're wondering, the difference between GDP and GNP is that GDP is used to represent the total value of goods produced within a country's borders, while GNP includes everything produced by residents of that country, whether or not it occurred within the geographical border. So, just something to be aware of. What some researchers suggest happened in that dramatic shift in GNP was that cultures in colder regions of the world had set themselves up early on to succeed in a global economy based on trade and procurement of resources. And once parts of the world, like the countries in Europe, the United States, and eventually China, held a lead in the race to grow their wealth in a new global economy, it was very hard for other nations to catch up. But looking at history can only get us so far when analyzing the question of why cold countries are generally more wealthy than hot countries. In order to truly understand what's going on in our world today, we need to examine why warmer temperatures are not as conducive to growing economies in the same way that colder climates are. This question can be broken down into several parts, but before we do, let's make one thing very, very clear. All humans have the same capacity for innovation and growth. Populations who lived in colder climates in the past and the present are not smarter, stronger, or more resourceful in any measurable way than other people who live in warmer parts of the world. A lot of the reasons that nations in Europe became so powerful and colonized much of the planet had to do with two things. First, the environmental resources available to them, and second, dumb luck. For example, many mathematical principles we use today came from the hottest regions of the Middle East. Gunpowder that allowed Europeans to decimate indigenous cultures came from China. And crops such as corn, potatoes, and chocolate all were domesticated first in the Americas. There's a chance that any of these people could have colonized the world if things had played out a little differently, or if they were placed in Europe and allowed to thrive over the centuries in the same way. Therefore, it's important to remember that the reason colder countries are wealthier today than warmer countries has very little to do with the people themselves and has much more to do with the environment and resources available to them in the past and present. However, it is also important to note that human factors such as colonization, corrupt governments, and pointless wars very much have impacted economic growth around the world. As mentioned earlier, there are several factors that influence an economy, and temperature is just one of them. So, as we examine the causal effect between warm climates and lack of wealth, it is important to keep in mind that there are other variables at play as well, but key insights can also be gained by isolating the temperature variable and assessing how it impacts economies around the world today. Let's start with tech. Technology is one of the most lucrative economic sectors in the world today. In 2022, the information technology market reached $8.51 trillion and is expected to grow to $11.5 trillion by the year 2026. Needless to say, technology plays a huge role in a country's wealth. However, not all technology is created equal. Before cell phones and microchips can make a country incredibly wealthy, there need to be certain fundamentals in place. This is where the disparity between countries in a cold region and those in warmer regions begins. Nations in the tropics have fallen behind in two technology sectors. The first is agriculture. Although creating massive amounts of crops is not the same indicator of prosperity as it was further back in human history, it is still incredibly important. Countries in colder climates have been innovating and coming up with new ways to harvest and improve the yield of farmlands for much longer than countries in warmer climates, just out of pure necessity. Warmer countries simply didn't need to improve agricultural technology quite as quickly as colder regions did because of their climate, which has led to a reversal in these countries' populations. In 1800, the global population was just over 1 billion people. 200 years later, there are around 8 billion people on the planet. This means that countries that already had advanced agricultural technology were able to sustain their population more easily as advances in medicine and all sorts of other areas meant that population numbers began to ramp up. Unfortunately, for many countries in the tropics, this technology was not developed at the same pace as in colder climates, where seasonal shifts forced agricultural industries to find unique ways to feed their growing populations. In fact, out of the 12 countries with the largest and most advanced agricultural technology sectors, there isn't a single one that is located in the tropics, with the top 3 being the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada. Now, rather than being forced to continue focusing on agriculture, many governments in colder countries can shift their attention to other, even more lucrative economic sectors, like communication technologies, advanced computers, and vehicles. Many countries in the tropics don't have the same agricultural tech advantage as colder countries. And with each year that goes by without abundant agricultural tech to improve crop yields, populations in poor, hot countries will be focused on trying to survive and put enough food on their tables rather than innovating and growing the country's economy. It should also be noted that the agricultural technology that was developed for temperate climates could diffuse across borders into other temperate climates. However, the same cannot be said about transferring technology to a warmer part of the world. There were certain innovations that made farming in colder regions more sustainable and bountiful that just wouldn't have worked in countries with hot climates. That being said, there's also certainly agricultural technology that could benefit all parts of the world regardless of temperature that has not been actively shared with poorer countries because it would not generate profits for the companies or governments that designed them. The other technological sector that has been hindered in many warmer countries is healthcare. When a country's population and workforce are suffering from diseases and illnesses, they're going to be much less productive than those with higher healthcare standards. Again, it is not because warmer climates don't have scientists and doctors to develop a booming healthcare sector. It's because of a lack of resources in general that hampers efforts to improve the quality of life in many warmer countries. We'll come back to why warm climates have such a negative impact on health later on. However, it is important to understand that many diseases and health problems that arise in warmer parts of the world don't exist in cooler regions. And while scientists and doctors in countries near the tropics know how to prevent or even cure many diseases, they just don't have the ability to make and disperse the necessary medicine due to societal and economic factors. But this is where we come back to the countries in temperate regions being so far ahead in terms of economic wealth that others can't catch up. Countries that are wealthy can afford to have large pharmaceutical companies that spend billions of dollars on research and development. This is why the vast majority of malaria drugs are made in colder countries where malaria isn't even an issue. These companies can make money off of the drugs even though they are not really used to improve the health of the people in the country they are based in. According to the National Institute of Health, a full course of malaria-curing medicine only costs about $2.40 in the United States. Yet, those same drugs, developed by the same company, are sold for 5 times the price in parts of Africa that desperately need the medicine to save lives. There are numerous examples of healthcare technology and medicine not being widely available in countries due to a lack of resources and money. This then exacerbates the healthcare situation, which costs more lives and bleeds the income of families dry who are trying to procure medicine and treatments to save their loved ones. And it should go without saying that if a government and its people are spending large sums of time and money on trying to procure medicine, they probably aren't innovating a growing lucrative business to boost their country's economy. So this is probably a good point to discuss why the technology gap and economic gap in general have grown so much between cold countries and hot countries. This will also help us better understand how certain countries in colder parts of the world wound up becoming so economically powerful and far ahead of others. It's been mentioned a couple of times, and it bears repeating again. Temperature itself is not the only reason that nations in the tropics tend to be less wealthy than countries in more temperate parts of the world. However, temperature did play a major role in the past that allowed specific nations to innovate in ways that would later benefit them. There is no better example of this than what happened in Europe, where Europeans were lucky enough to have an abundance of natural resources and an environment conducive to supporting the advancement of certain technologies that allowed them to become wealthy and expand early on. This advantage eventually led to European countries colonizing much of the world. However, it should be noted that countries in more temperate climates either remained territories or had close ties with Europe even after they gained their sovereignty. The same cannot be said of territories in the tropics that were colonized. It is here that many European colonizers set up governments, stripped the lands of their resources, and when it no longer suited them, left the country in shambles, and with power vacuums that were more often than not filled by ruthless leaders. It should then come as no surprise that countries in the tropics that were colonized struggled to find stability after they became sovereign nations. And without a stable government, an economy cannot grow. The temperature and byproducts of such a climate, such as higher rates of infectious diseases, are likely one of the reasons that some territories in the tropics were relinquished by colonizers, while colonies in more temperate regions were held onto. And from a purely economic perspective, a territory controlled by a country with a booming economy will almost always have more money and resources than a colony that has been exploited and then left to fend for itself. That is not to say that European colonizers should still be in control of territories around the world. It's just an observation of how government stability can play a major role in economy. Other than having barriers to securing healthcare necessities, the tropics also have much higher instances of disease because of the temperature. A healthy population definitely makes for a more productive workforce, which can result in a stronger economy. However, disease can hamper this productivity, especially when you consider all of the health and societal side effects diseases can have on a country. For example, infant mortality in countries in the tropics is 50% higher than in colder countries, and life expectancy is approximately 8% lower in hot countries than in cooler countries. These numbers paint a grim picture of how temperature, public health, and the economy can all be intertwined. One of the reasons that the tropics are hit so hard by disease is that there are rarely freezing temperatures, which typically hinder the reproductive and transmission cycles of viruses and bacteria. Instead, the pathogens have favorable conditions year-round, which allows them to infect more hosts than in colder climates. This can allow more virulent strains to evolve, as every time a pathogen jumps to a new host, there is a chance of mutations in its genetic code that could make it stronger or more resistant to current treatments. Another byproduct of hot weather year-round is that insect populations tend to flourish. In colder climates, insects die off and populations remain dormant for several months. This is why countries like the United States and Southern Europe, which had to contend with malaria for a time, were eventually able to virtually eradicate it. Every year, the population of mosquitoes would be suppressed during the cooler months, which allowed time for precautionary measures to be implemented and medication to be distributed. However, in tropical regions, this decline in insect population never occurs. This just further exacerbates the pathogen problem. It also leads to some major problems in other sectors of a country's economy as well. Even if agriculture isn't the most important sector of an economy, it is still critical for feeding a population and generating revenue through exports. However, contrary to what you might believe, hot, sunny weather year-round is not conducive to growing crops. For staple crops like rice, maize, and wheat, productivity and yield is actually much higher in temperate zones than in tropical ones. It's estimated that productivity for these plants per hectare is about 50% higher in countries with temperate climates. This can largely be attributed to many of the same factors mentioned before. Insects and pests are a huge problem for farmers in the tropics. Without the frost and cold seasons to push down entire fields of crops throughout the year, this means that more pesticides are sometimes used, which is not only expensive, but result in considerable environmental damage and degradation of the soil and water supply. This in turn creates less fertile fields, which then exacerbates the lower productivity of crops in the tropics. It will almost always be more affordable for developing economies to produce their own food rather than importing it. So, as farmers struggle to grow more crops in tropical regions, governments need to import more grain, fruits, and vegetables from other countries. This is costly and only puts more monetary burden on the population and economy as a whole. Also, the food being imported oftentimes comes from countries in temperate regions that have a surplus, which only leads to those economies growing even more, while countries in the tropics spend money to feed their populations. The top exporters of crops as of 2022 were the United States, which exported around $118 billion in crops, the Netherlands, which exported $79 billion in crops, followed by Germany and France, which each exported around $70 billion in crops. So it becomes quite clear from the data that countries in temperate regions are growing and selling more crops than countries in the tropics with higher temperatures. Seasonal variability is also very important for growing crops because frost and snow allow for buildup of organic matter that, when broken down, creates fertile topsoil. In the tropics, any organic matter lying on the surface is quickly broken down by insects and microbes such as bacteria and fungi. The quick decomposition does not allow large amounts of nutrients to be recycled back into the soil, and therefore the farmland can quickly become void of organic matter, which makes the land bountiful. Some research suggests that even though agriculture isn't as important to a nation's economy as it once was, past agricultural success allowed certain nations to accumulate huge amounts of capital early in history. Once these countries gained a head start in economic growth, it became very hard for other economies, especially those that were left in shambles after colonialism, to catch up. Of course, there are exceptions to every rule, and we are about to examine several nations that beat the odds and are prospering in the tropics. But before we do that, it is worth mentioning that all of the economic, health, and agricultural problems that countries in hotter climates are dealing with could be remedied. We have the technology to increase crop yields, even in some of the hottest places on the planet. We have access to medicine that could suppress or even wipe out infectious diseases that are plaguing countries in the tropics. We have the ability to form trade partnerships that would be mutually beneficial without taking advantage of a nation with a developing economy. As a species, we overwhelmingly choose not to do these things, especially at the highest levels of government and business. We live in a global economy where making a profit is more important than providing everyone with basic human rights. But maybe in the future, there will be a species-wide cultural shift to share technology, information, and medicine for the betterment of everyone. Despite having the cards stacked against them, some countries in the tropics have thriving economies. They are few and far between, but it does seem possible that if other economic factors such as political stability, technological advancement, and plentiful natural resources outpace the damage by hot temperatures, even nations in the tropics can have thriving economies. Perhaps the most prevalent example of this is Singapore. This island country and city-state sits just to the north of the equator, putting it in one of the hottest ecological zones in the world. The average temperature in Singapore is between 25 to 31 degrees Celsius, or 77 and 88 degrees Fahrenheit. However, it is rare that it ever gets much colder than this, meaning there are no months with temperate weather. Singapore also has a GDP per capita of around $118,887, which is the second highest in the world after Luxembourg. So how does Singapore have such a thriving economy? A lot of it has to do with the location of the city, along with key waterways that ships need to pass through in order to get from the Indian Ocean to the South China Sea and the rest of East Asia. This has made Singapore one of the trade capitals of the world. This, along with low taxes, few capital restrictions, and liberal immigration policies, has allowed the nation and its people to thrive despite being a warm weather country. Then there are countries in the Middle East, like Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain, which are all in the top 20 wealthiest nations in the world. In Qatar, the temperature is normally over 30 degrees Celsius, or 86 degrees Fahrenheit, every day of the year. In the UAE, the temperature ranges from 14 degrees Celsius to 41 degrees Celsius, or 57 degrees Fahrenheit to 106 degrees Fahrenheit. What is clear is that the temperatures in these regions rarely, if ever, dip below freezing, and there is little seasonal variation. However, this hasn't stopped them from amassing an enormous amount of wealth. But, unlike nations in Central Africa and the middle of South America, these countries have enormous amounts of oil, which is sold all around the world. And this single export literally fuels the entire economy of these countries. But fossil fuels won't last forever. When the oil runs out, so will the money. And once oil-rich nations may end up looking very similar to how other countries of the tropics do today. Then there is the other end of the spectrum. Not every cold country has a booming economy. North Korea is definitely in a cooler climate, where temperature in the winter months can reach as low as negative 26.5 degrees Celsius or negative 15.7 degrees Fahrenheit in some parts. Yet the GDP per capita in North Korea is around $1,300. This is unsurprising due to the stranglehold Kim Jong-un has over the country and the general lack of willingness to deal with any Western nations. The political dictatorship and isolationist policy against much of the world by North Korea has led to this temperate zone country being one of the poorest in the world. Then there is Russia. This nation literally encompasses almost all of the temperate zone of Asia, yet its economy is in shambles. But this isn't due to Russia not having resources or being technologically underdeveloped, but because the country is led by a power-hungry dictator and an authoritarian regime. Putin's war in Ukraine has led to sanctions being imposed on Russia, which is beginning to drive its economy into the ground. The Russian economy could be one of the largest in the world, but political actions and the war have led to a GDP per capita of around $12,000, putting it at 63rd from the top on the list of wealthiest nations. So what does the future hold? The data suggests that hotter temperatures correlate to lower economic output, so it's alarming that in the coming decades, the entire planet is going to get warmer as a result of climate change. It is highly likely that developing countries and poor nations will be the ones hit hardest by the changes in global temperatures, but even countries in temperate climates will feel the effects. Climate scientists estimate that global temperatures will be 1.5 degrees Celsius, or 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit, higher than today's average by the 2030s. Remember that calculation at the beginning of the video, that a 1 degree Celsius increase in average temperature causes GDP per capita to fall around $762? So, over the next decade, GDP per capita could theoretically drop by over $1,000 in certain parts of the world, solely because of higher temperatures. This doesn't take into consideration the environmental impacts, such as more intense storms and a rise in sea levels, which will likely cause even more damage to both individuals and economies. So while there is no definitive answer as to why countries with higher temperatures tend to be less wealthy than countries with cooler temperatures, it is likely a combination of technological, health, agricultural, societal, and historical factors that are contributing to the differences in economic prosperity that we see today, many of which are a result of past actions in human history. What we do know for sure, though, is the data shows a clear correlation between warm temperatures and a country having less wealth. More research still needs to be done, but hopefully we can learn from the past to create a better future for everyone.